Looking at Gia Carangi, this will be a powerful but tragic story. Her life was brief but incredibly impactful on the modeling world.
I started working with very good people, and a lot of work, all the time.
Let me start with the opening hook. She was the first supermodel before anyone knew what that word meant. Gia Carangi had a face that could stop traffic and a presence that made grown photographers tremble. In just 5 years, she went from a working-class kid from Philadelphia to the highest-paid model in the world, gracing the covers of Vogue and Cosmopolitan when most girls her age were worried about high school homework. Then she became the first famous face of AIDS. Gia died at 26, alone in a hospital room, her body ravaged by the disease that would claim an entire generation. But her story isn't just about drugs and death. It's about a girl who was too wild for an industry that demanded perfection, too real for a world built on fantasy, and too honest about her sexuality when honesty could end careers. How does someone burn so bright and flame out so fast? What really happened to the woman who changed modeling forever, then watched it all slip away through a needle? And why did the fashion world try so hard to forget the girl who gave them everything, including her life? Early struggle, 1960 to 1978. Philadelphia, 1960. South Philadelphia wasn't the kind of neighborhood that produced supermodels. This was working-class Italian-American territory, where men worked construction and women raised kids, where dreams stayed practical and nobody talked about fashion magazines. Gia Marie Carangi was born into a world of corner stores and church on Sundays, where the biggest excitement was a good cheesesteak and a Phillies win. Her father Joe ran a small restaurant. Her mother Kathleen worked when she could, but mostly battled demons that nobody talked about in those days. Depression, they'd whisper. Nerves. The kind of thing that kept a woman in bed for days while her kids figured out dinner for themselves. Gia learned early that she couldn't depend on anyone but herself. By the time she was 11, her parents' marriage was falling apart in spectacular fashion. Screaming matches that shook the walls, thrown dishes, nights when her father didn't come home at all. Gia would hide in her room, pressing pillows over her ears, trying to block out the sound of her world crumbling. When the divorce finally came, it felt almost like relief. But relief doesn't pay bills or put food on the table. Kathleen struggled to hold things together, working multiple jobs just to keep their small apartment. Gia, now a teenager, was essentially raising herself. And what a teenager she was becoming. By 14, Gia was already stunning in a way that made people stop and stare. Not pretty. Pretty was safe. Manageable. Gia was beautiful in a dangerous way, with dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets and a smile that promised trouble. She started hanging around the gay clubs in Center City, Philadelphia, places where a teenage girl probably shouldn't have been. But nobody asked for ID, and Gia looked older than her years. Here, among drag queens and artists and people who lived on society's margins, she found her real family. These weren't the church-going, marriage and kids people from her neighborhood. These were outsiders, rebels, people who understood what it meant to not fit into the boxes society tried to build around you. For the first time in her life, Gia felt like she belonged somewhere. It was in one of these clubs that someone first suggested she try modeling. "You've got the face for it," they said, and maybe they were just being kind to a lost kid. But Gia had nothing to lose and nowhere else to go. 18-year-old Gia takes a Greyhound bus to New York City with $200 in her pocket and a few Polaroid snapshots that barely qualified as a portfolio. She had no agent, no connections, no plan beyond showing up at modeling agencies and hoping someone would see what the people back in Philly had seen. New York in 1978 was a different city than it is today. Grittier, more dangerous, but also more forgiving of people who didn't fit the mold. The fashion world was changing too, moving away from the clean, wholesome look of the early 70s towards something edgier, more real. Gia walked into the offices of Wilhelmina Models looking like she'd stepped off the street because she had. No polish, no training, just raw magnetism that made everyone in the room stop what they were doing and stare. Wilhelmina Cooper, the legendary agent who discovered some of the biggest names in fashion, took one look at Gia and knew she was seeing something special. Not just another pretty face, but a force of nature. "You start Monday," she said. Just like that, the girl from South Philly was about to set the fashion world on fire. The golden years, 1978 to 1982, New York City, 1978. Gia's first professional photo shoot was with photographer Chris von Wangenheim for Vogue. She walked into the studio wearing ripped jeans and a leather jacket, her hair wild from the subway wind, looking nothing like the polished models everyone was used to. Von Wangenheim later said he knew within 5 minutes that he was photographing something revolutionary. Where other models posed, Gia moved. Where they smiled on cue, she smoldered. Where they took direction, she created her own reality in front of the camera. The shots from that first session were unlike anything Vogue had published. Raw, sexual, dangerous. She didn't model clothes, one photographer remembered. She made you forget clothes existed. Within 6 months, Gia Carangi was everywhere. Vogue, Cosmopolitan, Harper's Bazaar. Her face stared out from newsstands with an intensity that made people stop walking. This wasn't the sweet, girl-next-door beauty that had dominated the 70s. This was something primal, untamed. By 1979, Gia was earning $10,000 a day when most models made $200. She was living in a penthouse apartment, flying to shoots in Paris and Milan, partying with rock stars and artists. For a girl who'd grown up on food stamps, the transformation was intoxicating. But Gia brought her own rules to an industry built on conformity. She'd show up to shoots high or hungover. She'd refuse to work with photographers she didn't like. She'd disappear for days without telling her agency where she was going. In fashion, this behavior made her even more legendary. Gia was chaos, remembered Arthur Elgort, who shot some of her most famous images. But chaos that created magic. You never knew what you were going to get, but when it worked, it was pure electricity. The drugs started small. A little cocaine to stay sharp during long shoots. This was the late 70s, when Studio 54 was the center of the universe and everyone was doing everything. But where others treated drugs as party accessories, Gia was medicating something deeper. Then there was Sandy Linter, the makeup artist who became the love of Gia's life. In an industry where being gay was career suicide, their relationship had to remain hidden. The secrecy was poison, eating away at both of them. By 1980, Gia was the most photographed woman in America. She was also falling apart, and the industry that had celebrated her wildness was now being destroyed by it. The Fall, 1982 to 1986. Atlantic City, 1982. Gia Carangi, once the highest-paid model in the world, was working at her uncle's deli, slicing meat and ringing up customers who had no idea they were being served by someone who'd graced the cover of Vogue just months earlier. The fall had been swift and merciless. One day she was flying to Paris for Armani shoots, the next she was unemployable. Fashion had a zero-tolerance policy for unreliability, and Gia had crossed every line they'd drawn. But the real tragedy wasn't losing the career, and it was losing herself to heroin. The drug had started as an escape from the pressure, from the pain of hiding who she really was, from the loneliness of being constantly surrounded by people who saw her as a commodity rather than a person. Now it was the only thing that mattered. Everything else, family, friends, dreams, became secondary to the next fix. Her mother, Kathleen, watched helplessly as her daughter deteriorated. The vibrant, rebellious girl who'd conquered New York was becoming a ghost, hollow-eyed and desperate. Gia would disappear for days, then show up at home looking like she'd been through a war. She'd steal anything that wasn't nailed down, Kathleen later remembered. Jewelry, money, anything she could sell. It broke my heart, but the drugs made her into someone I didn't recognize. 1983 brought a brief glimmer of hope. Gia checked herself into rehab, determined to get clean and win back the life she'd lost. For a few months, it worked. She was clean, healthy, even started getting some modeling work again. Photographers who'd written her off began cautiously reaching out. But the fashion world had moved on. New faces had taken her place on magazine covers. The edgy, dangerous look she'd pioneered was being done by models who showed up on time and didn't come with baggage. Gia was yesterday's news trying to make a comeback in an industry that worshipped only today. The pressure of trying to rebuild while staying clean proved too much. By the end of 1983, she was using again, harder than before. The brief taste of what she'd lost made the reality of her situation even more unbearable. This time, the descent was faster. Gia started working as a prostitute to fund her habit, selling her body on the streets of New York and Philadelphia. The face that had sold millions of magazines was now advertising something very different in the back pages of underground newspapers. Gia's arms were so damaged from needle use that she'd started injecting between her toes, behind her knees, anywhere she could find a vein that hadn't collapsed. Friends from her modeling days would cross the street rather than face what she'd become. But Gia kept trying to get clean. Rehab attempts, methadone programs, desperate promises to family members who were running out of hope. Each time she'd get a few weeks or months sober, start to look like the woman she used to be, then fall again. The gay community that had embraced her as a teenager was being decimated by a mysterious disease that doctors were just beginning to understand. AIDS was killing her friends one by one, and Gia, with her history of needle sharing and risky behavior, was living on borrowed time. Gia's last modeling job was a low-budget shoot for a small magazine. Nothing like the Vogue covers and Versace campaigns of her glory days. The photographer later said she looked tired, defeated, like someone who knew the game was almost over. By then, she was sharing needles with anyone who had drugs. Addiction had stripped away every instinct for self-preservation. The woman who'd once been fearless in front of cameras was now reckless with her own life. Her family made one last desperate attempt to save her, staging an intervention that ended with Gia screaming at everyone she'd ever loved, accusing them of trying to control her, of never understanding her pain. It was the last time some of them would see her alive. Gia was living in abandoned buildings, selling everything she owned, looking like a skeleton wrapped in the remains of once beautiful skin. The modeling world had completely forgotten her. New York's fashion elite were partying at clubs where her pictures had once hung on the walls, but nobody mentioned her name anymore. On October 18, 1986, Gia's mother got a call from Hahnemann University Hospital in Philadelphia. Her daughter had been found unconscious in her apartment, suffering from what appeared to be pneumonia complications. What they didn't know yet was that Gia Carangi was about to become the first famous face of AIDS, the disease that would define a generation's understanding of tragedy and loss. The girl who'd lived fast and burned bright was about to become a cautionary tale that the fashion world would spend decades trying to forget. The End and Legacy, 1986 to present, November 18, 1986. Hahnemann University Hospital, Philadelphia. Gia Carangi died alone at 3:30 a.m., her body destroyed by AIDS-related complications. She was 26 years old. The woman who'd once commanded $10,000 a day weighed barely 80 pounds. Her arms were scarred from years of needle use, her face gaunt and unrecognizable. Only her mother and a few close friends attended the funeral. The fashion world that had once worshipped her was conspicuously absent. For years, Gia's death was treated like a dirty secret. AIDS carried such stigma that magazines refused to mention how she died. The industry simply erased her, airbrushing her from their history like she'd never existed. But Gia's influence couldn't be buried. Every edgy campaign, every heroin-chic model, every photographer looking for that raw, dangerous energy was chasing what she'd created. Kate Moss, Naomi Campbell, even today's Instagram models owe something to the intensity Gia brought to fashion. 1998 changed everything. HBO's Gia, starring Angelina Jolie, introduced a new generation to her story. Suddenly, the model the industry had tried to forget became a legend. Young women watched Jolie embody Gia's magnetism and tragedy, making her posthumously more famous than she'd ever been alive. Today, Gia Carangi is remembered as the first supermodel, the woman who proved that fashion could be dangerous, real, and heartbreaking. She showed an entire industry what they could create and what it could cost. The girl from South Philly who burned too bright remains fashion's most beautiful tragedy. Gia Carangi blazed through fashion like a comet, beautiful and doomed. If her tragic story moved you, subscribe for more untold tales of fame's ultimate price.